With the help of Hashem, we are learning Moed Katan Daf Chav Vav. We left off on Daf Chav Hey Amid Beis Mamish at the end of the Amid Tana Rabbanan going to Daf Chav Vav. Today's Daf is going to be about details concerning the mitzvah of Kriya. So we're going to have more cases where one is obligated to rend, to tear one's garments. We're going to have, for example, when a person hears Shmu'os Ra'os, bad tidings, as we'll define, there has to be Kriya. When a person sees Ara Yehuda Bechurbanam, when you see Pasha, the territory and the cities in the territory of Yehuda, Bechurbanam means when they are not under Jewish control, you have to do Kriya. When a person sees the place of the Beis HaMikdash that's not yet rebuilt, regardless who's in charge, you have to do Kriya. And many other details. We're going to learn also details. If you remember, we learned about shoylel and ma'acha. Shoylel is some sort of a very inferior type of stitching a rend. So there's shoylelin or shoylel, and then there's ma'acha. Ma'acha means to the best of one's ability to properly mend, fix the torn part of the beged. So we already learned above the difference between father and mother and between shar kroivim. We're going to have other details regarding shoylel and ma'acha, and that's going to lead us into something very interesting. It's very sad. We're learning about sad topics, but what happens if a person heard that some relative passed away, for which they're chayiv to rip kriya, and they ripped kriya. They tore their garment. After, we'll see, the shiva, or after the shloishim, they heard that another relative passed away. Are they allowed to extend the kriya? Which will be very much connected to, and what happens if they were already shoylel, the previous one, or if they were ma'ache, that will play into whether they can extend it or not. And here again, there'll be a difference between the kriya over father and mother, which we learned. It's not only about one has to rip all of the garments, but also the length of the tear that we learned above, that normally a tear is one tefach, even though today we're going to learn a machlokes about that. When it comes to father and mother, you always begin from the top. When it comes to father and mother, you have to rip until it exposes the area of the heart, which can be more than a tefach. We're going to see how that will also play into this question whether you can extend for whom was the first kriya. Then we're going to have a very interesting chazal. Hayoytze bebeged kerua lifnei hameis. That means a person has a relative that passed away, and they put on a garment that was already ripped before. And the Gemara has a very strong expression, Hareze goizel, this person is stealing both from the Mesim and from the Chaim, as we'll explain. We're going to have something very important, especially for doctors, and the truth be told for all of us, whether one should withhold information that is tragic information from someone who's ill. When someone is ill on a certain level, notifying them, for example, that they had a relative that passed away can bring their demise even closer. So we're going to learn about withholding that information, and this is the source in the Gemara, even though there's only one line. B'chlal, when it comes to doctors, like there are scenarios that there is a right on the doctor and on the people around the patient not to give the patient the full truth, if it's determined that the full truth will be detrimental to their health. And finally, if we'll have time, at the end of the Amid, we're going to go back to the Mishnah that spoke about Sudas Havra'ah. So after the burial, the first meal that the mourners eat is a meal that's not bought from their pocket. Other people, non-family members, buy a meal. This happens ad hayoyim hazeh. It's a very simple meal. It's bread and eggs. And it's given to the mourners. Now the minig in the times of the Mishnah Gemara, in the times of Chazal, is that the visitors, the chaverim, would join the meal. But the Mishnah says, but make sure that only the mourner should be the one sitting on a low chair, on an overturned bed. And all of the visitors should not sit. They should sit on a proper, the way they would sit on seats in the times of the Gemara. And our Gemara will give an exception with a very deep lesson when it comes to friendship and a lot more. Chavra, let's start. Again, we left off at Mamish at the end.
Rabbi, did you mean detrimental to their spiritual, physical, mental health?
That's a good question. I'll leave it open. I'll leave that open, Baruch. We're going to just touch upon it. Yeah, I know this is something I'm sure that you guys struggle with a lot. I can say very generally, Baruch, that it's all connected. We view mental and emotional and physical health from the times of the Gemara to be very much connected. Because when a person is in good spirits, the person has a greater chance of recovering. When a person is emotionally down, they're more vulnerable even to physical things. And on a more subtle level that goes to a spiritual. So we'll get back to that, at least to know where the topic is from. Okay, Tana Rabbanan, Daf Chavav on the top. We learned in a Brais, more people for whom the Elu Kirayim, more rent garments, that she'ein misachin, that may never be fully mended. Now we only learned never being allowed to fully mend above for father and mother. For a kriya that was made alav and valimay, now we're going to learn more. Hakoireya alav, if we're reviewing, if a person chas v'shalom lost a father and they did kriya, even after 30 days, we learned they can only be shoylol, remember that? But they cannot be ma'achem, never. Va'alima, same thing for the mother. Now let's go. Va'al rabbi shalim dei Torah, the person tore kriya because the one who taught him the majority of his Torah passed away. Va'al nasi, the leader of the Jewish people, we call the Rebbe. Va'al av Bezdin, the great Torah scholar of the generation, now knew. Va'al shmuai sarais, hearing bad news more. The Gemara is going to define each one. It's not as general as it sounds. How do you define bad news? We'll see. Va'al birchas Hashem, if one heard someone blaspheming, and we're going to use from now on the words that the Gemara uses. So the actual meaning is if someone curses God, but we don't even say that. We say if someone blesses God, and it's a euphemism. And we'll go on with the blessing God. So if someone who blesses God's name, Va'al Sefer Torah shenisraf, here it's if a person sees a Sefer Torah being burned, again there are many details all the way in halacha. I mean there are times that there's a tragic fire and a Sefer Torah is burnt. And then there are times that someone intentionally burnt the Sefer Torah. That's the one for which you have to rip kriya. Va'al Ari Yehuda, and if a person sees the cities of Yehuda, and Va'al HaMikdash, and on the base HaMikdash, Va'al Yerushalayim, when they are in ruins, you have to rip kriya. Now, halachically, again, we're going to give some more details as we unpackage this. Huge difference between ripping kriya for seeing the cities of Yehuda in their churban, as we'll have the words later, versus Mikdash and Yerushalayim. The other Yehuda's churban means when it's not under Jewish control. Which means that when the Yidden, like nowadays, have control over Yehuda, even if they didn't yet build up a city, it's not called a churban, because it's in our power to do so. When it comes to Mikdash, it's not about who controls, let's say, Harabayis, it's about whether the temple is built or not. And Yerushalayim, L'chora, is an extension of the Beis HaMikdash. Now, the Koireya al Mikdash, if a person, as the Gemara is going to specify, clarify, if a person came from the east, let's say, and the first thing they saw was the place of the Beis HaMikdash, and they tore kriya, and then they see the city of Yerushalayim that's not yet rebuilt. So here they are allowed, they're not mechuyev to rip their beged in another location, always beginning from the top, but they can simply extend that which was already torn a little bit more. Further down, because you rip from top to bottom. You don't rip horizontally. And the Gemara is going to clarify, and not on the opposite. If a person began ripping kriya for Yerushalayim, you can't add for the Beis HaMikdash. And we're going to learn, like we mentioned in the introduction, B'chlal, if a person ripped kriya for one relative, and then after a certain period in the morning, they hear there's another relative, the rule will be that if the first kriya was for someone for whom you have to mourn on a higher level, then you are allowed to extend for someone whom you only have to mourn for relatively on a lower level, but not the other way around. We're gonna go through the details in a moment. Okay, end of Brais. And now the Gemara is going to go case by case sources and further detailed clarifications. And Verabde Shalom de Torah. How do you know what? How do you know two things? How do you know that you have to rip? And how do you know that this is a rendering of the garments that cannot be properly amended, right? Ve'ein misachin, because it says regarding Elisha's witnessing the ascension of his rabbi, of his teacher, Eliyahu Hanavi, Elisha Roye. And when he sees Eliyahu Hanavi going up in that fiery chariot, for who mitzaek, and he's shouting, Avi, Avi, Father, Father. Rechev Yisrael u'parashav. Yisrael's, the Jewish people's, chariot and horsemen. And the pasuk explicitly writes that he rent his garments. So Avi, I know that he called Eliyahu father, but we are learning now a limud. Avi means that when there's Aviv and Ima, you have to rent your garments. Rechev Yisrael u'parashav. Who is the one who is, so to say, the Jewish people's chariot and horsemen? Ze Rabbi Shalim de Torah. How is the Rabbi Shalim de Torah your chariot and horsemen? My mashma. So the Gemara explains, Kedem Targem Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef was the master Metargemin. Rebbe, the Tav Lohoin Li Yisrael, a Rebbe, someone who masters Torah, has the koyach to bring good to the Jewish people, b'tzelusei, with his prayers, just like, or even more than, made a sichon u'parashan. More benefit that you get from having a chariot and horsemen. In other words, you have physical guards, people that have a lot of physical power. Even more powerful is a Rebbe that davens for you. Now, by the way, that doesn't have to be your Rebbe, but your Rebbe is going to be davening for you. So who is my greatest protector? Of course it's God. But who's looking out for me more than anything else with the greatest effectiveness? The Rebbe that taught me Torah, because it's a given that the Rebbe is going to daven especially for his Talmidim. And now that they passed away, for such a person you have to mourn by rendering the garments and expressing the grief by never fully mending it. And how do you see that in that pasuk? Because it says there, mamash, regarding that event, that vayachazek bebegodav, that Elisha grabbed onto his garments, vayik ro'im, and he tore it and he rend it, lishnayim kiroyim. Now we already had that kasha above. If it's rent, of course it's into two. So here we're having another limud, which is mimash mashen emar vayik ro'im eni yodei shel shnayim. Elo melamed shekiroyim v'oimdim l'shnayim lo'olam. L'shnayim means that it always has to remain in two parts, two pieces. In other words, even though shoyleil, which is some inferior type of stitching, is allowed, but anyone who looks at it will see this is a torn garment, and this is one of the cases where you may never fully mend it. Problem is, Eliyahu Navi didn't die. Love it. So in other words, you know what this question is? Why did he Bechlal have to tear his garments? To which Rabbi Yechanan responded, because since it says that he physically never saw him, so l'gabed kemeis dami. That's where people get confused, that they're great tzaddikim, and like we spoke about yesterday, and tzaddik dispater ishtakach, right? He's found in this world, but it's tragic when they pass away, because you can't physically see them, and for that you have to do kriya. Nasi va'av beis din.
Is there any halacha that says that if somebody's still alive,
so the Shuki Mamash is touching on something that's brought down in the Shulchan Aruch. As long as there is a possibility for you seeing, that's exactly the comparison. Maybe in the Noise Kalim of the Shulchan Aruch, if someone is in this world, it's possible you're going to see them, even though you don't plan to see them, and they went to New Zealand, and it's before there were airplanes. Shaykh. Once a person passes away, seeing them the way we see them alive is no longer on the table until Tchias HaMeis. Nasi v'ayv beis din shmuas reis min alon. So now we're going to another story. As much as there was a challenge between David and Shaul, but the Torah records how David reacted when he heard that Shaul and his children passed away in a battle. During that battle, the majority of the Jewish men were present there, and it was a terrible blow to the Jewish people. So it says that Vayachazek David bibegadav, that he grabbed onto his garments, and Vayikroim, and he tore it. V'gam kol hanoshim asher itoi. They followed what King David did. And Vayispedu, and they gave a eulogy, Vayivko, and they cried, Vayitzum, and they fasted until the evening. For what? Al Shaul, Va'al Yehoinasan Benoi, Va'al Am Hashem, Va'al Beis Yisrael, Ki Naflu Becharev. Taiches the Gemara. Shaul is the Nasi. He was the king. Yehoinasan Ze'av Beis Din. Just make a mental note of this, because there's questions on this. How was Yehoinasan the Av Beis Din? like wasn't Doyeg Ha'adoimi, then the Av Beis Din, but leave that open. Here we are saying Yohaneson represents the Av Beis Din. Va'al Am Hashem v'al Beis Yisrael. In other words, there was such a loss of battle. Who lost the battle? This will be the key. The majority of the Jewish people. Or it affected the majority of the Jewish people. Elu Shmua Sarais, bad tidings for which when you hear it, you have to rent your garments. Amalei Rav Bar Shaba to Rav Kahana, the Ema Ad Havu Kulu. Maybe you only have to do Kriyam when both the Nasi and the Av Beis Din, Verstehst, and Shmua Sarais, Amalei, no. The Torah repeats the words al. Al this and for that, for al, hifsikoin, and each one individually causes you, right, is a reason to be mechoyev kriya. Is it true? I'll give you stories where people heard bad tidings and they didn't rip kriya. For example, when they notified Shmuel that Katal Shvoir Malka, that Shvoir Malka killed Teresar Alfe Yehudoi, 12,000 Jewish people in the neighborhood called Mizigas Keisarei. And after he heard that news, Shmuel, the great Shmuel, did not do Kriya. Answers the Gemara, Izaraya lo yamru, when are you obligated to do Kriya for Shmuel Yisrois? Ela b'roiv tzibur. Bad tidings that involve Roiv b'nei Yisrael. And that's the key, that by the battle that Shaul fell, the numbers of Jewish soldiers that were there were tremendous. And that was a loss of a battle that affected Roiv b'nei Yisrael. Okay. Like we just mentioned with pasuk of David and Shaul. Hold on, a side question. Umi katal Shvoir Malka Yudoi, did Shvoir Malka kill Jews? Veha Amalei Shvoir Malka l'Shmuel, they had a relationship. Shvoir Malka was a Persian king, and he told him, Teiseli, everyone is Teiseling in the Gemara. Teiseli means, God owes me, or Gan Eden is coming to me. I deserve, I'm worthy. This is such an American statement, huh? Gavaldik Teiseli, Doloi Kotli Yehudim Oilam. He says, I never killed a Jew. Here we're saying that he killed 12,000 Jews. So the Gemara answers, no. What he meant to say was Hasam Inu Garmel and Afshayu. There they made a rebellion. What Shvar Malka prouded himself by the fact that he wasn't prided himself, he wasn't an anti-Semite. He didn't stam kill a Jew the way other rulers kill Jews. There, they made a rebellion. When they made a rebellion, the king feels he has full right to go and to quash the rebellion. To Amar Avami, regarding the moment where the Yidden in Mezigas Keisari were attempting to become independent by rebelling, by throwing the yoke of the government off, the Kal Yisirei, the Mezigas Keisari, that they were so joyful in their initial independence, that they were playing harp strings, they were playing musical instruments. You know how much music they were playing? So much that the walls in Lutkia, in a neighboring village, those walls cracked from the noise. It's an expression. In other words, they really rebelled against the king. Pekah, Shura, the wall, Pekah means it cracked, in the city of the Lutkia. In other words, they made a rebellion, so he had the right to crush them. And in that crushing of the rebellion, 12,000 Jews got killed at Rahman al-Itzlan. But you can't say Shver Malka is still correct when he told Shmuel that I never killed a Jew for no reason. Okay. Albirchas Hashem, when you hear someone blessing God, euphemism. How do you know that you have to rent your garments? Minolon dechsiv. Vayavoy Eliyakim ben Chilkiyo asher al Abayis. Eliyakim, the one who was in charge of the palace, and Shebna the scribe, and Yoyach ben Asav Hamaskir, the recorder. It's interesting that we call the Rebbe's secretaries Maskirim. Recorder means someone who's really doing nothing other than just writing notes of what's going on. Okay, and El Chizkiyahu Kiruye Bigodim, when they came to Chizkiyahu, they came with rent garments, and the pasuk over there is speaking about those who heard someone blaspheming, and when they came and notified Chizkiyahu HaMelech, they already came with rent garments. Is the Haraya, why did they rip their garments? Why did they rip Kriya? Because they heard someone blaspheming. Now there are some details just to speak out. Birchas Hashem is when someone actually says Hashem's name. And he curses the name of God, articulated. Okay, weiter. Tana Rabbanan, more details regarding Birchas Hashem. Echad Hashemeya, whether you heard directly yourself someone blaspheming, Or the echad hashemeya mipi hashemeya. Who is going to hear mipi hashemeya? I'll tell you who. The people in court, the dayanim. Because you know what? The edim that testify in court that so-and-so said, blasphemed, they have to repeat verbatim what was said. Now the edim, even though they're hearing themselves speak, they don't have to rip again. They ripped when they heard it, and now they're only repeating it in a beis din. But anyone who hears it first degree from them also has to rip kriya. Chayiv lekroya. But veho edim, they're not chayiv lekroya. Shekfar koru b'shasha shamu. Says the Gemara, so what? So what that they heard it, but they are repeating it and they are hearing themselves. And the dayanim have to rent their garments. B'shasha shamu, frek the Gemara, may have a hakashami hashta, they're hearing it again. So Gemara says, Loi salka daita. That's not, don't think about it, that's not a problem. Because it says, let's go back to the source. From where do we know we have to rip kriya? From this event. There it says, the words that were said, which is blessing God. So Vayikras begadav, it says Chizkiyahu Melech tore his garments. Clearly from that we can infer only the king then tore his garments, but they, the witnesses, didn't, because they already tore their garments and they were simply repeating in a beis din about what happened. Now,
it's so bad, why repeat it?
because if you don't testify in court exactly as to what happened, then you can't punish someone. Birchas Hashem is a capital crime. And beis din things have to be exact. This is what happened, not meramis, not the hint to what happened. Weiter. When the Braisa says that this is a kriya similar to Aviv and Imoy and Rabbi, that you can never fully mend it, how do you know that? We have an interesting concept. This is all drashas. We have a Gzeira Shaveh in Nach itself. Our kriya from Chizkiyahu, from the story of Elisha and Eliyahu. Kriya. Sefer Torah shenisraf min olam. Sefer Torah that's burnt. Again, in halacha, burnt doesn't mean a tragedy in a shul, but it means someone purposefully burnt a Sefer Torah. You have to rip your garments. D'chsiv vayihi kikroi Yehudi. When a Jew began to read 3 dalasais means doors or stanzas. It means psukim. Now, what happened is that parts of Eicha that were composed b'nevuah by Yirmiyahu, they were composed way before the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. It wasn't written all in one go. Perek Aleph, we're going to see, not all the psukim in Seder. It's written on Aleph base, if you remember. Psukim were written before, and someone relayed to the king the words that Yirmiyahu was saying. And at some point, he got so angry that he tore those verses that were written, and he burnt it. And even though this is not what we call a Sefer Torah, clearly the Sefer Torah means any part of Tanakh, including Nach, including Ksuvim, right? Which is Eicha. So when he read 3 dalasais and then the 4th, really what happened was, the Gemara is going to say, he read 3 psukim and a 4th psuk, and there was no reaction yet. But after, really when he read pasuk Hey, then Vayikra'el Besa'ar HaSofer, then they took a scribe's razor and he cut out, we'll see, he tore out God's names that are written in Eicha. He like don't shoot the messenger. The messenger here was the scripture. So he cut it open, and he threw it into the fire. Asher al ha'ach, that was on the fireplace. That's the pasuk. Now this is about Melech Yehoyakim, who reacted that way. Says the Gemara, "My shalosh dalasis va'arba." And again, the pshat is put a comma after va'arba. Means he heard 3. He heard even a 4th, but he didn't yet hear it. He only tore it and burnt it after the 5th. So the Gemara says, whoever was carrying these prophetic words of Eicha prior to the Churban read that Yirmiyahu, I want you to know that Kosav Yirmiyah Sefer Kinnis. He wrote a book of Lamentations. So Amar Lahu, so the king Yehoyakim asked the messengers, Mike Siv Bey. So they told him, Eicha Yashva Badad. That Eicha, how is it? Or alas, she, meaning the city of Yerushalayim, sits in desolation. So when he heard those words, he said, fine, I'm the king. I'm the king, meaning, I don't care. Because when the people suffer, you know who suffers last? The government. They tax the people, they're good. So the city will be in desolation. Say that, I'm the king, I'm not Nispal, I'm going to be fine. Amar lei, you see, say that aleph base. So pasuk aleph is eicha, pasuk base is base. Bachai sifka valayla. They're going to cry bitterly at night. So he said, okay, say that I'm the king. I'm not going to cry at night. For me, it's good. Gol say Yehuda Ma'oini. There's going to be galus. So he felt, okay, only the people will go into exile. I'm the king. That's already pasuk number 4, right? Dalid. Still, Ana Malka. However, the moment that he read pasuk 5, Vashteit Hayu Tzoreha L'Roish, which means that our adversaries, our Tzoreha, they'll become the leaders. Oh, 1 second. That means that I'm going to be dethroned. Now you're writing that I'm going to lose my position. Amalu man amra. Who said that? And he didn't say who said it. He kept on reading the pasuk. You know why? Ki Hashem hoiga. God spoke that this is going to happen because of the many peshoyim. Ooh, he got very angry. Miyad kodar kol askari sheba. He cut out God's holy names and he burnt the whole parchment in fire. Tosfos points out, he has another version. In other words, that he brings from the Yerushalmi, it wasn't about cutting out God's names. That's something else. We're speaking about a Sefer Torah Shenisrav. No, he cut it and he burnt it. Not goyres God's names. It's not about the burning of the God name, it's about burning a Sefer Torah. And again, it's interesting, 2 things here. Number 1, it's not Sefer Torah, it's Ksuvim. On the other hand, it wasn't an accident, because tragically throughout history, sometimes a shul can burn down and sometimes it's a tragedy. But the concept of Kriya is like the source. If someone purposefully burns any of the Chav Dalid Sifrei Kodesh. V'hainu d'chsiv, v'loi pochadu, that v'loi kodo is big dayim, that the people who witnessed that, the pasuk is criticizing for them not being afraid of what they saw and not rending their garments. That's a word of criticism. So b'chlal is an ayah that if someone witnesses someone burning purposefully a sefer, the bo'el lemikra. Let's go. Eiman mishum, maybe now that we already established that when you hear shmu ois rois, you have to hear kriyam. Maybe they should have torn their clothing not because they witnessed King Yehoiakim burning. No, because they heard in the words of prophecy that Yerushalayim is going to be Yashva Badad, that Hayot Sarel L'Roish, Amalei Shmuas Rois Beishata Mihava. That tidings, very important rule, doesn't mean that you heard about a futuristic event, even though it's coming from a Navi and you know it's going to happen. Shmuas Rois means that something already happened that affected the Reiv Am Yisrael. That's called Shmuas Rois. When you read the Toichacha, no one has to rip Kriya. After the Holocaust, when people heard about they killed 6 million of us, that's when you have to rip Kriya. You understand? Because it happened, not that because it's going to happen. If you see a Sefer Torah being torn, you have to rent your garment twice. So the gvil is the white parchment. The ksav is the black letters, the white fire and the black fire, the oir hasoiviv and the oir hamamali, which is exactly what that represents. And you have to therefore rip kriya too. It's not just about the letters that are torn, it's the parchment that's torn. Also, as it says that Achrei Sreif HaMelech HaSamegillah, this is this story that we just read about. This is Yehoiakim ripping up parts of the pre-foretold Eicha. The Es Hadvarim. So you see, it says 2 things. He ripped the Megillah and he wrote the Dvarim. Dvarim is Mamali, the words. The Megillah means that just for the Megillah you have to rip Kriya. Now, if you remember, we learned in Mesachtas Megillah, right, about how you sew the Sefer Torah, and how we spoke that when you do Galila you put the sew in the center. Again, there's accidental tearing, which could happen. We don't rip kriya for accidents, just halacha l'maisa. But if, God forbid, someone did it on purpose, really what we learned is that if someone tore, God forbid, a Sefer Torah, even if they didn't cut through the letters, you have to rip kriya. Rab Abba v'Rafuna bar Chia have Yosvi. And they were sitting, either the girsa is in front of Rab Abba, or you put a comma, and instead of kame, read, Kom Rab Abba Rab Abba stood up. This is whichever way. Rab Abba needed to relieve himself to the bathroom, and people used to sit the whole times with tefillin, and you have to remove your tefillin. So Shakle lit toitafte toitafos. Right? You're beautiful. He removed his tefillin, and Achasei Abei Sodya, he placed it on a respectful place. He placed it on the cushion that was on the ground, but it was near the ground. Asoi barna amisa, an ostrich came, and the ostrich almost swallowed his tefillin. So Amari says, "Ooh, hashta ichayvanli shtei kriyos." That now, ooh, see, he didn't know. Like we keep on quoting, you only have to rip kriya if it's done on purpose. He says that if the ostrich would have bitten or swallowed or ruined my tefillin, I would have to rip kriya twice. In other words, he wanted to make it clear that it's not only for a whole sefer, for the parshas and the tefillin. This is sad that it actually happened. Someone had their tefillin eaten up, and I came in front of Rav Masna, and I asked Rav Masna, what am I obligated to do? And Rav Masna didn't know. So I went in front of Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda told me, this is what Shmuel said, that he also removed this tefillin and it was eaten by an animal. So he told him, Lo yamru ela bizroya. Bizroya means, if someone did it on purpose, b'koyach, that's for why you have to rip kriya. Because the whole source is the source of King Yehoiakim. King Yehoiakim tore Eicha. Kamaisa Shahaya. If it's not as bad as that, today you give tzedakah, maybe then they would fast, but not kriya. Ari Yehuda min alon. Ari Yehuda doesn't mean that you are seeing it destroyed. It means that you are seeing a city of Yehuda not under Jewish dominion. So when God, now thank God, before Mashiach we have dominion over parts of Eretz Yisrael, that takes away Bechlal the obligation for rending one's garments for Ari Yehuda. Ari Yehuda min alon, because it says, Vayavai anoshim mishchem, mishiloi umishoimran, shmoinim ish, when they came, they already came with their, after having done various steps that are done by mourners, that they cut their beards and they ripped their garments, them and they cut their flesh. This is a pasuk regarding those who came. They didn't yet know the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. They came with karbanos. And it's not only that when they arrived, they saw that there's no Beis Hamikdash. Since prior to coming to the Makam Hamikdash, they walked through various cities of Yehuda and they saw them bechurbanam, so they already rent their garments. They already came with rent garments. Amar Rab Chelbai, Amar Ola Bira, in the name of Rabbi Lazar. It's not just that you rip your garments, but you should say, you should cry out to God that your holy cities became a desert, and you have to then v'koireya Yerushalayim b'churbana oimer tzion midbar hoisa, and Yerushalayim became a wasteland. These are psukim. V'koireya Beis Hamikdash b'churbanoi. That means looking at the place of the Mikdash and not seeing an actual Beis Hamikdash. You have to say Beis Kachenu, that our holy house, v'tifartenu, and the house of our splendor. Asher hilulcha v'seinu, that our forefathers praised you for. Hoya l'sreifas eish, became burnt in fire. V'chol machmadenu, everything that we desire is hoya l'charba, is in ruin. And then v'koreya. Okay, and now
They cut their flesh.
that's something that we're not allowed to do. That's something that we're not allowed to do.
Right, so
They did it. They had so much pain. There's a Gemara in Ksubas that when Rabbeinu HaKadosh passed away, Ashkafta the Rebbe, there was a launderer that committed suicide. He couldn't live without Rebbe. And normally suicide is considered murder, mamish. And the Gemara says that a heavenly voice came out and said that everyone that participated in the burial of Rebbe, including the launderer, is going to go to Olam Haba. No, you're speaking about the Churban Abayis. We're not allowed to do it, but after the fact, they were so broken by the Churban. Okay, we're not judging, but we're not allowed to do that. But the ripping of the garment is something that they were obligated to do. We're learning from them.
Why shaving beards?
Also, that they tore out their hair.
We do the opposite.
I know that. But that's the way they expressed mourning. It doesn't say shave, it says they tore out, I think, right? Migulach, yeah, it was something that the biggest disgrace is when you cut your beard, in our perspective. Okay, now we're going to go into detail. Details are can you, this is important, can you extend a kriya? The whole daf is about kriya. We got to learn it. Part of Torah. So here we go. It says, Kadei ala migdash. If first you rent your garments on the Beis HaMikdash, Begashmias, there are certain places, like when you come from the east, you're going to see the Makam HaMikdash first. Then you're going to see Yerushalayim. So then you don't have to make a new Kriya. Then you can be Moisev al Yerushalayim. 3 lines from the bottom, V'niminu, we learned in a Braisa, Echat Hashemeya. Right? When we hear, what are we talking about? Hearing. When you hear, guys, this is hearing about the Churban, according to many Poskim, only while the Churban is happening. Not us, because we also heard about the Churban. But when you hear about the Churban while it's happening, or if you see the place of the Mikdash, even now, almost 2,000 years after it happened, but you see the place. That's the difference. Shemiya is Machayev Kriyam if it's B'Shas Maisa. Kivin Sheyela Tzoifim, once you come Tzoifim Machlekes, whether it's a specific place or whether it's any place near Yerushalayim, from where you can see the place of the Beis HaMikdash, Kaireya. And the Braisa says, you rip once for the Beis HaMikdash, Bifnei Atzma, and a new cut, a new rending for Yerushalayim. You can't add. So answers the Gemara like Hashem. If you first see the Makom HaMikdash, this is the Nakuda, so the first rending was for something more chamur. This is going to be negea to the Amud Beis. Then you see Yerushalayim, compared to the Beis HaMikdash, it's less chamur. You can add. You have to add, but you don't have to make a new one. But if first you see Yerushalayim, that means the first here was for something relatively less heartbreaking. You can't add, because it's the Iker in Beis HaMikdash, not a tafel, not a secondary addition. Now let's go. Tana Rabbanim learned in a Braisa that V'kulan means everything that we began today's daf with. You just look on top of the Amid. When we said that K'ro'in ve'ein mesachtim, Aviv, Imoy, Rabbi, Nasi, Yav Beis Din, Shmos, everything that we learned above, even though the Braisa says you cannot fully mend it, but yes, you are allowed to be shoylel. Now, shoylel, we're going to speak about various ways of stitching, of mending that are considered halachically a inferior type of fixing. So in English, not that it helps me, shoylel means to baste. To me, it means to give it to a yeshiva boy. Give it to me. When I'll sew it up, that's not ma'achin. One way is called moilelon. Moilelon is you fold it and then you sew it. Loikton means you gather and then you stitch it. That I'm very familiar with. You stitch something and the begadim are all gathered together. You can see that someone who doesn't know what they're doing, that's okay. That's not called stitching it up. And you can make stitches like ladder. So ladder might mean that they're uneven, like a ladder. One stitch here, one stitch higher, one stitch lower. That's a very, and by the way, when we learned above that for Avav and Imoy, you can't do anything. Only after 30 days, even after 30 days, you can't be ma'acha, but you can be shoylel. Okay, now, Omar Rab Chizde Daf Chavav Amid Beis. What type of ichoy is not allowed? You know what type of ichoy is not allowed? Ube ichoy Alexandri. Whatever that means. They had the best way of mending garments. According to some Rishonim, they had a technique that they would take all of the loose threads and they would weave it back into the garment. So they mamish that, in other words, you cannot perfectly fix it. If you don't do as a perfect ichoy Alexandri, then everything else that you did is in the category of shoylel, and that will be permissible. People were poor. You'll see soon. People only had one beged. Today, big deal. You put your beged in your closet. Some people throw it out. Some people have a minute to keep it forever. Allah v'imoy. Then they couldn't afford that. We're going to learn about people that the whole life they had one beged, and they ended up during their lives they lost all their relatives. And what should they do? There's no room to, we'll see, like Nebach, Tana Rabbana. It mamish, this one sugya beautifully flows into the other. A person heard that they had a relative that passed away. Someone. And they did kriya. And then they did shlol. Now what did we just say? We said, Shuki, that shlol is not really mended. If shlol is not really mended, let me ask you, if you re-tear that area, did you do something? No. It's a double-sided coin. If shalol is not really considered mended, then opening up the shlal is not considered kriya. So if you ripped inside the shlol, which is the mending, or in the milol, in the folding, or in the leket, or in the gathering, or in these uneven stitches, the ladder stitches, you reopen that up, it's not called kriya, because it was never considered mended to begin with, lo yatsa. But if you ripped through the ichui, yeah, that's called a proper kriya, because that's the whole point. That's why you're not allowed to be ma'acha, because ma'acha is considered like brand new. And here again, Rab Chizda says, what type of ripping through the area that previously there was a kriya, that you're saying, it's considered a good kriya only if the ichui was Alexandri.
So his kula is now chumrah.
Yeah, you want to word it that way. Just, it fits together. Shalol means nothing. Shalol just means that you're not sloppy. But it's not fixed. You can see it's a torn garment. Wow. That when we said you're not allowed to properly fix it, first of all, you can't do any of this immediately, Shuki. But after the normal time, whether it's a Shiva, whether it's Shloshim, we'll see details later, a person can change the whole direction of their beged. The beged was a jalaba. And what you can do is you can open up the neck to make it the bottom where your feet go through. You can close the bottom more. If you turn the garment upside down, because that's all the beged that you have, now you can be ma'ach at the bottom. Okay. Rab Shimon holds that even if you inverted the garment, still asur la achoisa. Guys, achoisa is not sister. Achoisa is from ma'acha. That even if you inverted the beged, the fact that it's a kriya, in other words, you know what you see? It's a din like in the beged. The beged cannot be fixed. And furthermore, it's not only you, the one who rent the garment. You may not fix it. Let's say if you sold it to someone else. This is a wow. In other words, the isur of ichui is not a din on the gavra. It's a din on the beged. And that's why a moiched has to notify the lokeach that this kriya isn't, a shlamazel kriya. No, it's because someone was mourning. And if it's a mourning for a case or for a person for whom you can't do ichu, you have to let the lokeach know. If not, it's a mekach to. First, the first kriya, this is other than father and mother. We learned this above. What's the minimum amount? 1 tefach. V'toisefes, here we go. V'toisefes means that if another relative passed away, again, after a certain point, either after the Shiva or after the Shloshim, and now you heard it, and now you have to make another kriya, you can rip it further. But when you add, you only have to add 3 fingers. You don't have to add, you know why? It makes sense, because once you added, you already have a tefach. Now, why dafka 3 fingers? So there's a din that a beged, the minimum size beged for beged to be called beged is 3 etzba'os for dinam tumantana. Divid Rab Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, he says no. He says the first time you rip it, you only have to rip it the length of 3 fingers. Because it's not about you're grabbing onto it, it's about the beged. The beged is 3 etzba'os. And v'toisefes, if you're going to use that garment, and you're going to only add to that rend area, you have to add just a kolshu. That makes sense, because when you added the kolshu, you already have the 3 fingers plus. Amarula halacha Rav Meir b'kriya, which is chamur, because Rav Meir holds you have to rip a tefach, and halacha Rabbi Yehuda at least b'teisefes. Tanya namihachi Rabbi Yosi Omer tchilas kriya has to be a tefach, but when if you add in the cases where you are allowed to add only kolshu. Tana Rabbana. Now we're going to go into cases where you're adding. Amrulay meis aviv. Person, God forbid, heard that his father passed away. And v'kara. Now, the first period of mourning ended. You have to insert these words. Whether it's Shiva or Shloshim, emachloikasum. And now, he heard Nebach that meis benoi. And he added, like we just learned above. Now, Chavre, what did we also learn? We learned that other than father and mother, after a certain time, you can fully mend it. So what's the din over here? Says the Braisa, tachtoin misache. In other words, that's after 30 days for Benoi, that you can mamish fix it. That you can fully mend the added kriya, because the added kriya was for the son. But the Elyon, which was made for the father, Eina Mesacha, like any other case that you cannot fully mend if the Kriya was for father. Now what happens if the order was the opposite? First, Meis Benoi, and he did Kriya. And then he heard his father passed away, and V'hoisif. Same halacha. Elyon Mesacha, the upper part could be mended, and the Tachton Eina Mesacha. Now guys, I want you to appreciate the Chiddush in the statement. Because what did we learn? There's a flow here. We learned that when you add, how much do you have to add? Only a little bit. How is the little bit enough? Because you are counting that which was ripped before as part of the Kriya. So you would think in the second case that since the second Kriya was for Aviv, which you may never be Mis'acheh, and that is really a continuation of the beginning, so maybe the dinim that Eina Mesacha now, retroactively Ki'ilu, should be Chal on the Elyon. That's a Chiddush. That only the Tachton Eina Mesacha. Now, next case. If a person heard at one time, all of these people passed away. Rahman al-Itzlan. He heard Meis Aviv, Meis Holocaust, Meis Imoy, Meis Achiv, Meis Achoisoi. Says the first Tana Kriya Kera Echad L'Kulam. He's allowed to rip one Kriya. When did we say you have to add? That's because there was Kriya, and then there was a later event. If you heard it all together, or if it happened all together, one Kriya is enough. Rabbi Yehuda said, no, Al Kulam Kara Echad, for Shar Kareva, for 5 out of the 7, you're right, 1 will be enough. But, Alav Alimai, father or mother, in our case, father and mother, Kara Echad, individually. Why? These are his words. Lefisha ein moisifin al kera ava v'imoy. Because when you rip one time, when we learned above the concept of adding, it's mentioning either you heard about the new tragedy 7 days later or 30 days later, but not prior. If it's within the same Shiva, then you can't add. So think about it. If a person is going to rip their garments, if they have in mind when they begin father and mother, then it cannot be good for the other relatives. The only question is, why can't they have in mind the other relatives first and then father and mother? That's the Gemara's kasha. My tamam, all right, because when a person hears the news, that's the way it's going to work. He's going to rip for that which is most painful. He's going to be ripping first for father and mother in his mind. And for everyone else. The moment it's father and mother, you can't add to that when you hear it at the same time. Now, Amar Shmuel, halachic Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseidon. Now, this is a bomb. Why? Because Shmuel is the Amoira that we keep on quoting that holds that we are lenient by Avelus. We are halachic kitivri amekel ba'avelus. Here, the Tanakama holds that you can make one kriya. It's only Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseidon that says you have to do separate ones for Aviv and Imoy. But why was he machmer? Frek the Gemara, the last narrow line. Mi Amar Shmuel Hachi. Didn't we learn Amar Shmuel Halachi to be a mekel be'evel? Answers the Gemara, don't entangle avelus and kriya. And we don't do kriya with avelus. We do kriya either at the moment of death, and the minig now became kriya is done prior or connected to burial before there's any dini avelus. I know there's dini of oininess, of an oinin or oininin, but don't confuse one with the other. Here are the words: avelus lechud, kriya lechud. So we're makel by avelus, we're not makel by kriya. Today is a kriya daf. Adechin koireya. Now, when we're speaking about extensions, now there has to be a point that it's so torn. Adding nachwi paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, right? That was Rabbi Yossi. Koldahu. It's already so big, the rip. Adding is not doing anything. So there's a certain point that you can't add. So one opinion holds atiburai. Until it reaches the height of your navel, you can still add. Once you hit that height, that means you're going down. You're ripping down. Then you can't add. Yesh oivnim machmer ad liboy. And because it says v'kiru levavchem v'al bigdeichem. So the fact that we are juxtaposing levavchem and kriya on bigdeichem, once you pass the height of the heart, adding doesn't do anything. Now you got to rip again. From where, guys? From the top. And we're speaking about a time where people were poor. So once it hits tiburay, marchek shalosh it's boitz v'kareya. You have to make a new. But the question is now, guys, in the width, how far apart? You understand that it has to be 3, a finger breadth in halacha always means the width of your thumb. Always. 3, like when it comes to tzitzis and the kanaf and all that, it has to be within the 3. 3, and then you begin a new one. Nismala Malafanov, theoretically, no one should have so much tzaras. The point is, what happens if you have to rip kriya in the front, not on the back? But if it's, you have to keep it 3 boys away. So you're ripping, and if it's full, then you can turn the beged around. And then you continuously rip from the front. If both the front and the back are, God forbid, fully torn, you still have an option of inverting the garment like we learned above. Says the Baraisa, but if while you're wearing the garment in its direction, and you're going to rip milmata lamaila, or if you're going to rip it horizontally, which I saw, it's very common for this to happen. When people try to rip their beged now, because we have real good begadim. So even though that someone begins with a razor or with a scissor, it's very common that the ovel, the oinen, the rip is going to be horizontal. That's not good. That has to be vertical. That's minatz dadim. That means if you rip it either from the bottom up, milmata lamaila, or right from right to left to right, you're not yoytze. How do I know that? Because since the Torah says that a kohen gadol who may never rent his garments, still he rips it from the hem, from the bottom up, is arayeh. You understand that the kohen gadol is doing it not for hilchos kriya. He's doing it because of it's also the laws of mourning. Aside of them, first and foremost being halacha, they are healthy, emotionally healthy mediums through which to externalize grief. And there is a healing aspect to externalizing your pain by doing kriya. So he does the kriya. He gets the human part of it, but not halachically. How does he do that? He rips it from the bottom, from the hem up. Is that ayah that halachically kriya is from the top down?
What about sideways?
Sideways is not good.
Couldn't you say that with Kohen Gadol?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. It's not a kasha from that. Okay, says Rav Masna or Marukva. And both of them argued, also going back to the earlier generation. One was quoting the father of Shmuel, and the other one was quoting Levi. One of them says, Kol Shiva Koireya. Kol Shiva Koireya means that as long as Shiva passed, that's what we were speaking about adding. So there's hearing at the same time, that we had the machlokes, and we paskin like Yehuda ben Beseira. Then there is hearing one far away from the other. How much time has to pass? 7 days. Means even if a person is in the shloishim, God forbid, of let's say of his brother or sister, and then they heard another relative dies, they are allowed to add because it's already out of the mourning for the first. Ula'achar shiva moisef. No, during Shiva you have to make a new kriya. You can't add. That's the same thing. During Shiva you can't make, but the moment Shiva passed, that is where you can extend. No, it's more than that. That if a person hears about another passing, but within the shloishim of the first, he also has to make a new kriya. All of the dinim that we learned above about extending is only after the shloishim. Why is that? Because you can't even do shoylel during the Shiva, as we learned above. Let me ask you, when the master taught us that a woman, for her dignity, is allowed to do shoylaltoi right away. So maybe let's say that for a woman, even during the Shiva, should she be allowed to be moisif? Now, undoing the shoylel is nothing, we already said. But maybe she should be allowed to extend, and the Baraisa made no such differentiation. So the Gemara says, no, she can't. Because the only reason why we allow her to poorly mend her garment was only because of dignity we want to give to the woman. But we're not going to allow her to extend it. She's bound by the same rules of a man. Now, next question. Why is that? What's the magic of 30 l'chayda? Because in certain cases, we're not allowed to be ma'achad during the shloishim, right? You have to wait until after. So Ella, if the fact is that for Avav and Imoy, you can never, so maybe Avav and Imoy, you should never be allowed to extend. But there's no such a thing. You could extend. So here again, really, the beged you can be ma'acha. It's because of kavod avav imoy. That's why you can never fully mend it. But since, so to say, there is no din on the beged that it cannot be fixed, just that you cannot be the one doing the fixing, because of you have to give kavod to your parents. That's why after shloshim you are allowed to extend it, as we learned above. Tana Rabbanan. Hayoytze bebeged kirul lefnei hameis. And people are poor, we're not judging them. People have one beged, and if they're going to rip their beged, That's it. They don't have a beged. They can amend it like this, amend it like that. No, they don't want to rip it. So what this person heard about the close relative that passed away, he took a pre-cut beged and he wore it. In other words, is the mitzvah to do the ripping or is the mitzvah to go with torn? He felt, I'm going with torn clothing. Says the Gemara, says the Braisa, Hadeza Goizel, he's stealing both from the Mesim and from the Chaim. In other words, the Chaim, he's tricking. He's tricking the Chaim because they think that he did Kriya when he didn't, because you have to actually rip your garments. He's stealing from the Mesim because he didn't rent it for them. As our expression.
How does this fit with the Tosefes? You can do Tosefes.
Tosefes you can do. Here he did nothing because I'm ripping. Yeah, here I'm not adding, I'm just taking a beged that's already ripped and I'm using the same beged. I'm not adding anything.
Oh, you're not ripping it?
No, I'm just taking a pre-ripped beged, exactly. I'm just wearing a beged that was already torn. Rashba Goimer, another Gavaldik Allah. Chavre, again, people were poor. A very practical question. If someone heard that his father is sick, that's the case here, and they're going to visit them, but the beged that the son has is, alta beged. They want to go to the father respectful, so they borrow a beged from their friend. And when and then that person's father passes away, are they allowed to rip the beged? If a person tells his friend, Hashileni chalukcha, please lend to me your shirt. So I wouldn't go visit my father, and he says that he's sick. And he went and he found his father after he passed away, or after his father passed away. Says the Braisa, says Rashbag, that being that when he borrowed the beged, he told the lender, for my father who's sick, it's as if, it's as if he indirectly, he asked him, if my father will pass away, can I also rip the garment? If the lender wouldn't want for it to happen, he would not lend the garment. He's going to visit his father who's sick. So that means he has permission. Now, he has to be ma'achet, which is very important. Even though we learned chavra al ovav al imoy, eina ma'achel oilam, that's only if he owns the garment. Like we said, it's not a din on the beged. It's mishum kvoid aviv. Now that it's someone else's beged, then he fixes it. Now, I know that fixing it means, we learned on top of the Amid, Ichoy Alexandri, it's going to be the best, but it's not going to be perfect, and he has to give the difference of the money. He has to give him back the garment, and he has to give him the money that it will, the devaluation. But what happens if he didn't tell his friend, I'm going to visit that person's father who's sick? He didn't say someone is sick, someone for whom, if they pass away, is chayv to do kriya. Then, there's no, you're not allowed to use your fellow's money without their reshus to fulfill your mitzvah. Now, this person will have to put on his beged and do kriya. He's not patur from kriya, but he may not do kriya on that beged. Tana Rabbanan. At least let's touch what we began to share with. We learned in a Braisa, someone who's sick, and one of the chayla's relatives for whom he has to mourn passed away. Says the Braisa, Ein moidian oisoi shemeis. Don't let him know. Why? Shema titarev datoi olav. Because his mind will become muddled. Now, I want you to know, this is very important. A doctor is not here right now, Dr. Baruch, but actually the Poskim learned from this Chazal that if not for a health concern, which we have to take into account, a health concern for an ill person, means everyone gets hurt when they hear news. And I'm sure it affects everyone's health to a certain degree. But if someone is a chayla, you're putting their life in danger. You know what we are medayik from this braisa? That if there isn't such a concern that they might die, or titarev datoi, you're obligated to give the information to the chayla. That's what they learned from over here. This is, if there is a fear of someone dying. Now, I know the words are not dying, titarev dati, but titarev dati means he's going to lose his mind, and a chayla who's going to lose his mind, his very life is in danger. So if there is a life danger issue, then are you allowed to withhold information? When they say a joke that a patient, he wants to know what's his status, in the hospital he should call up the front desk. because they'll tell a stranger, how is the patient doing in room 205? And the person will give you more information sometimes than the people that enter your room. Mamish. There's a minute here, they don't tell you anything. You might sue them, you might this, you don't know. You're mechuyev to give a patient only if it touches titar of dati. We'll leave it at that. And therefore, it's not just you can't tell them explicitly. What about ve'ein mekaram befanav? In other words, imagine someone is visiting the chayla, the relatives, and they enter with a rent garment. What do you chacham? And also, umishatkin as anoshim mipanav. You silence if women are visiting the chayla and their eyes are baggy and they're crying and they're shrine. Silence them.
So we see from here. Otherwise, if it's not for the situation, aim
Emishatkin as anoshim. As Eitz Toiva, never silence a woman. It's a good advice. This only over here. Very good. And the final din will continue tomorrow. Umeka'arin lekatan mepnei agmas nefesh. That means that if a katan, one of the katan's relatives passed away, so then the adults rip his garments, and it's not because of chinuch. That's the point. Because be mechanach to keep Shabbos. Don't be mechanach someone how to mourn. Since when other people see a child with a rent garment, they feel the pain. So it's done to bring about more emotions by the other adults. And not because there is any chiyuv on a katan, not even for beautiful. You're not b'chanech hilchas avelis. Many rabbanim don't even learn hilchas avelis properly. We know a little bit, and during the, today you have access to information quickly, because that's not chinuch. Be mechanach for every other part of Yiddishkeit, and God willing, b'chlal the bila hamavas lenetzach, and there won't be any dinim going forward. We're going to stop over here, and again, just like when we finished Megillah, being that daf chavtes is a relatively small daf, and the next dafim are very big, it's going to work out, right? Today's Thursday, so we have Friday, Shabbos. We're going to, God willing, 3 more shiurim, we're going to finish it, and every daf we're going to fall behind a little bit, so the daf chavtes won't be a 2-minute daf.